self-importance was a monster that had 3,000 heads, and one could face up to it and destroy it in any of three ways. The first way was to sever each head one at a time. The second was to reach that mysterious state of being called the place of no pity, which destroyed self-importance by slowly starving it. And the third was to pay for the instantaneous annihilation of the 3,000-headed monster with one's symbolic death. Don Juan said that all the apprentices, including himself, had never been in total agreement about anything except that Tulio was a contemptibly arrogant little man. They hated Tulio because he either avoided them or snubbed them. He treated them all with such disdain that they felt like dirt. They were all convinced that Tulio never spoke to them because he had nothing to say, and that his most salient feature, his arrogant aloofness, was a cover for his timidity. Yet in spite of his unpleasant personality, to the chagrin of all the apprentices, Tulio had undue influence on the household, especially on the Nagual Julian, who seemed to dote on him. One morning the Nagual Julian sent all the apprentices on a day-long errand to the city. The only person left in the house, besides the older members of the household, was Don Juan. Around midday the Nagual Julian headed for his study to do his daily bookkeeping. As he was going in, he casually asked Don Juan to help him with the accounts. Don Juan began to look through the receipts and soon realized that to continue he needed some information that Tulio, the overseer of the property, had and had forgotten to note down. The Nagual Julian was definitely angry at Tulio's oversight, which pleased Don Juan. The Nagual impatiently ordered Don Juan to find Tulio, who was out in the field supervising the workers, and ask him to come to the study. Don Juan, gloating at the idea of annoying Tulio, ran half a mile to the fields, accompanied, of course, by a field hand to protect him from the monstrous man. He found Tulio supervising the workers from a distance, as always. Don Juan had noticed that Tulio hated to come into direct contact with people, and always watched from afar. In a harsh voice, and with an exaggeratedly imperious manner, Don Juan demanded that Tulio accompany him to the house, because the Nagual required his services. Tulio, his voice barely audible, replied that he was too busy at the moment, but that in about an hour he would be free to come. Don Juan insisted, knowing that Tulio would not bother to argue with him and would simply dismiss him with a turn of his head. He was shocked when Tulio began to yell obscenities at him. The scene was so out of character for Tulio that even the farm workers stopped their labor and looked at one another questioningly. Don Juan was sure they had never heard Tulio raise his voice, much less yell improprieties. His own surprise was so great that he laughed nervously, which made Tulio extremely angry. He even hurled a rock at the frightened Don Juan, who fled. Don Juan and his bodyguard immediately ran back to the house. At the front door, they found Tulio. He was quietly talking and laughing with some of the women. As was his custom, he turned his head away, ignoring Don Juan. Don Juan began angrily to chastise him for socializing there when the Nagual wanted him in his study. Tulio and the women looked at Don Juan as if he had gone mad. But Tulio was not his usual self that day. Instantly he yelled at Don Juan to shut his damned mouth and mind his own damned business. He blatantly accused Don Juan of trying to put him in a bad light with the Nagual Julian. The women showed their dismay by gasping loudly and looking disapprovingly at Don Juan. They tried to calm Tulio. Don Juan ordered Tulio to go to the Nagual's study and explain the accounts. Tulio told him to go to hell. Don Juan was shaking with anger. The simple task of asking for the accounts had turned into a nightmare. He controlled his temper. The women were watching him intently, which angered him all over again. In a silent rage, he ran to the Nagual's study. Tulio and the women went back to talking and laughing quietly as though they were celebrating a private joke. Don Juan's surprise was total when he entered the study and found Tulio sitting at the Nagual's desk, absorbed in his bookkeeping. Don Juan made a supreme effort and controlled his anger. He smiled at Tulio. He no longer had the need to confront Tulio. He had suddenly understood that the Nagual, Julian, was using Tulio to test him, to see if he would lose his temper. He would not give him that satisfaction. Without looking up from his accounts, Tulio said that if Don Juan was looking for the Nagual, he would probably find him at the other end of the house. Don Juan raced to the other end of the house to find the Nagual Julian walking slowly around the patio with Tulio at his side. The Nagual appeared to be engrossed in his conversation with Tulio. Tulio gently nudged the Nagual's sleeve and said in a low voice that his assistant was there. The Nagual matter-of-factly explained to Don Juan everything about the account they had been working on. It was a long, detailed, and thorough explanation. He said then that all Don Juan had to do was to bring the account book from the study so that they could make the entry and have Tulio sign it. Don Juan could not understand what was happening. The detailed explanation and the Nagual's matter-of-fact tone had brought everything into the realm of mundane affairs. Tulio impatiently ordered Don Juan to hurry up and fetch the book, because he was busy. He was needed somewhere else. By now, Don Juan had resigned himself to being a clown. He knew that the Nagual was up to something. He had that strange look in his eyes, which Don Juan always associated with his beastly jokes. Besides, Tulio had talked more that day than he had in the entire 2 years Don Juan had been in the house. Without uttering a word, Don Juan went back to the study, and as he had expected, Tulio had gotten there first. He was sitting on the corner of the desk, waiting for Don Juan, impatiently tapping the floor with the hard heel of his boot. He held out the ledger Don Juan was after, gave it to him, and told him to be on his way. Despite being prepared, Don Juan was astonished. He stared at the man, who became angry and abusive. Don Juan had to struggle not to explode. He kept saying to himself that all this was merely a test of his attitude. He had visions of being thrown out of the house if he failed the test. In the midst of his turmoil, he was still able to wonder about the speed with which Tulio managed always to be one jump ahead of him. Don Juan certainly anticipated that Tulio would be waiting with the Nagual. Still, when he saw him there, although he wasn't surprised, he was incredulous. He had raced through the house, following the shortest route. There was no way that Tulio could run faster than he. Furthermore, if Tulio had run, he would have had to run right alongside Don Juan. The Nagual Julian took the account book from Don Juan with an air of indifference. He made the entry. Tulio signed it. Then they continued talking about the account, disregarding Don Juan, whose eyes were fixed on Tulio. Don Juan wanted to figure out what kind of test they were putting him through. It had to be a test of his attitude, he thought. After all, in that house, his attitude had always been the issue. The Nagual dismissed Don Juan, saying he wanted to be alone with Tulio to discuss business. Don Juan immediately went looking for the women to find out what they would say about this strange situation. He had gone 10 feet when he encountered 2 of the women and Tulio. The 3 of them were caught up in a most animated conversation. He saw them before they had seen him, so he ran back to the Nagual. Tulio was there, talking with the Nagual. An incredible suspicion entered Don Juan's mind. He ran to the study. Tulio was immersed in his bookkeeping and didn't even acknowledge Don Juan. Don Juan asked him what was going on. Tulio was his usual self this time. He didn't answer or look at Don Juan. Don Juan had, at that moment, another inconceivable thought. He ran to the stable, saddled 2 horses, and asked his morning bodyguard to accompany him again. They galloped to the place where they had seen Tulio earlier. He was exactly where they had left him. He did not speak to Don Juan. He shrugged his shoulders and turned his head when Don Juan questioned him. Don Juan and his companion galloped back to the house. He left the man to care for the horses and rushed into the house. Tulio was lunching with the women, and Tulio was also talking to the Nagual, and Tulio was also working on the books. Don Juan sat down and felt the cold sweat of fear. He knew that the Nagual Julian was testing him with one of his horrible jokes. He reasoned that he had 3 courses of action. He could behave as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. He could figure out the test himself, or, since the Nagual had engraved in his mind that he was there to explain anything Don Juan wanted, he could confront the Nagual and ask for clarification. He decided to ask. He went to the Nagual and asked him to explain what was being done to him. The Nagual was alone then, still working on his accounts. He put the ledger aside and smiled at Don Juan. He said that the 21 not-doings he had taught Don Juan to perform were the tools that could sever the 3,000 heads of self-importance, but that those tools had not been effective with Don Juan at all. Thus, he was trying the second method for destroying self-importance, which meant putting Don Juan into the state of being called the place of no pity. Don Juan was convinced then that the Nagual Julian was utterly mad. Hearing him talk about not-doings or about monsters with 3,000 heads or about places of no pity, Don Juan felt almost sorry for him. The Nagual Julian very calmly asked Don Juan to go to the storage shed in the back of the house and ask Tulio to come out. Don Juan sighed and did his best not to burst out laughing. The Nagual's methods were too obvious. Don Juan knew that the Nagual wanted to continue the test using Tulio. I walked into that shed and found 4 Tulios. What do you mean, 4 Tulios? I asked. There were 4 men in that shed, Don Juan replied, and all of them were Tulio. Can you imagine my surprise? All of them were sitting in the same position, their legs crossed and pressed tightly together. They were waiting for me. I looked at them and ran away, screaming. My benefactor held me down on the ground outside the door, and then, truly horrified, I saw how the 4 Tulios came out of the shed and advanced toward me. I screamed and screamed while the Tulios pecked me with their hard fingers like huge birds attacking. I screamed until I felt something give in me, and I entered a state of superb indifference. Never in all my life had I felt something so extraordinary. I brushed off the Tulios and got up. They had just been tickling me. They were such magnificent stalkers that for all practical purposes, only one of them existed. Although people saw and dealt with them daily, nobody outside the members of the household knew that there were 4 Tulios. Because of his unusual clarity, he knew he had reached the place of no pity. And he understood all by himself that the place of no pity was a position of the assemblage point, a position which rendered self-pity inoperative.